I can't breathe. One of the last words uttered by George Floyd before his death. Words that will be at the very center of the murder trial of the state of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. We're going to take a look at those charges in today's episode. I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you are watching Lawyer Up. In today's episode, we're going to look at the 3 charges against Officer Derek Chauvin for the death of George Floyd. We're going to look specifically at how Minnesota defines second-degree murder, how they define third-degree murder, and how they define second-degree manslaughter. So if you enjoy the episode, hit that like button. If you got something to say, comment below. Now, this video is going to be specific to the criminal charges. We have a separate video that's talking about the facts of what happened that day. If you're interested in that information, check out that video. We'll also do a separate video about legal arguments made by the lawyers. If you're interested in legal arguments, make sure you check out that video. Also, if you want to keep up with everything that's happening during the trial of Officer Derek Chauvin, then subscribe to the channel. And if you've got friends out there that would enjoy this type of YouTube entertainment, then share me on social media. So let's start with the general concept of murder, right? As it's known around the world. Murder is the intentional and unjustified killing of another human being. And right, it's got to be both, right? It's got to be intentional. You have to mean to do it. If it's an accident, it's not murder. Maybe something else, but it's not murder. And it has to be unjustified. So even if it's intentional, if it's legally justified, it's not murder. Giving you the example, if I break into your house in the middle of the night and you pull out a gun and you shoot me as an intruder, the cops may say, well, did you intend to kill him? You're like, hell yeah, I intended to kill him. He broke into my house. However, it's not murder because you were legally justified in doing so. So when you're talking about murder, as a general rule, it is the intentional and unjustified killing of another human being. Now, switch gears to manslaughter. That is the unintentional and unjustified killing of another human being. And this is a scenario where you didn't mean for the person to die. They just did. And it's beyond a regular just accident. This involves gross negligence or recklessness. And the example for manslaughter is the DWI accident, where you got drunk and you got into an accident and you killed somebody. Well, you didn't intend for that person to die. However, you were acting with gross negligence, criminal negligence, or reckless, and a death occurred. And so generally, the unintentional deaths are classified as manslaughter. Now, that you understand those two concepts, you can completely forget about everything that I just said, because all 50 states define murder and manslaughter entirely different. So you have to look specifically at each state statute to know what they are talking about when they say murder. Some states just have murder and manslaughter. That's it. Other states break the murder down into degrees, and everybody's heard of first degree and second degree. Well, 3 states have a third degree murder, including Minnesota, and we're going to look at their statute. And when it comes to manslaughter, a lot of states break that down into first degree and second degree. Some call it voluntary and involuntary. Sometimes if it involves an automobile, they call it vehicular manslaughter. So it's chaos. You have to look at the exact statute from the exact state to really understand how that state defines murder. So that is what we're going to do with the charges against Officer Derek Chauvin in regard to the death of George Floyd. Now, we know he's charged with second-degree unintentional murder. And to me, murder has to be intentional, right? We just talked about that. So the fact that there's an unintentional murder, that's kind of an oxymoron with my way of thinking, but they have that in Minnesota, and we're going to look at that. Also, there's third-degree murder, which they call depraved heart murder or depraved mind murder. We're going to talk about what that entails. And then also a second-degree manslaughter charge. What are the elements of that particular charge? So we're going to look at each one of those, and we're going to look at the charge against Officer Chauvin, which incorporates those elements. So we're going to look at what the prosecutor has to prove to have him found guilty in the eyes of the jury. Now, the first charge that we have is second-degree murder, and this is second-degree unintentional murder. It's generally referred to as the felony murder rule. Even though you don't have any intent to kill somebody, you are charged with murder because you were engaged in a felony. And let me read the charges against Officer Chauvin. It is that on or about May 25 of 2020 in Hennepin County, Minnesota, Derek Michael Chauvin, without intent, caused the death of George Floyd while committing or attempting to commit a felony offense with force or violence. So here's what the prosecutor has to do. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, number one, that Officer Chauvin caused the death of George Floyd. And we're not going to get into the facts. We did that in a separate video, but we're going to have dueling autopsies that are going to fight about whether Officer Chauvin did, in fact, cause Floyd's death. So that's the first thing the prosecutor has to prove. Secondly, he has to prove that this death was caused while Officer Chauvin was committing a felony offense with force or violence. So when you look at the scenario of kneeling on Floyd's neck, the only really felony offense that would apply would be a felony assault. And Minnesota defines that as a physical assault with substantial bodily harm, which probably would fit the scenario. However, a police officer, when effecting an arrest, they have a lot of different immunities, a lot of different defenses that don't apply to you and me. If I try to take you into custody outside of some convenience store, that would be an assault. However, if you're a law enforcement officer, you have certain immunities, you have certain privileges, and certain defenses. So finding Officer Chauvin guilty of second-degree murder may be difficult. It may be difficult primarily because proving that he was engaged in a felony at the time. However, if the prosecutor can prove that, Officer Chauvin faces up to 40 years in prison for that particular charge. The second charge that is against Officer Chauvin is the third-degree murder charge. And let me read that. It says that on or about May 25 of 2020 in Hennepin County, Minnesota, Derek Michael Chauvin caused the death of George Floyd by perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others and inventing a depraved mind without regard for human life. Now, that's a mouthful, right? This is generally called depraved heart murder or depraved mind murder. This is what the prosecutor has to prove to have Officer Chauvin found guilty of third-degree murder, right? Number one, of course, that Chauvin caused the death of Floyd. We talked about that with the dueling autopsies. They have to prove that. Number two, by acting eminently dangerous. Now, they don't have to be committing a felony like in the other charge, but they have to be acting dangerously. And probably putting your knee on the back of somebody's neck for 8+ minutes, that probably is an eminently dangerous act. But he has to have done that with a depraved mind without regard for human life. Now, that's a weird phrase, depraved mind. It's kind of odd. You look up the word depraved in the dictionary, it means immoral or wicked. But when I hear depraved mind, I think about, sounds like an 80s garage band. Coming to the stage is depraved mind. So it doesn't really mean anything to me. What most states have done with this depraved heart, depraved mind kind of a statute is they have used the words deliberate indifference. So what most states will do is they will call this deliberate indifference, that you were intentionally indifferent to what happened. You intentionally didn't care. So if we are summarizing the third-degree murder statute in Minnesota, it's essentially saying that you engaged in a dangerous act and you were indifferent as to whether it caused a death or not. Just indifferent. Whatever happens, happens. And obviously that's going to be a little easier for the prosecutor to prove, more likely to prove that. The charge is a lesser charge than second-degree murder, so the sentence is less. The potential sentence, if found guilty, would be up to 25 years in prison under the third-degree murder. Now, the third and final charge against Officer Chauvin is manslaughter in the second degree. And the charge reads like this: that on or about May 25th, 2020, in Hennepin County, Minnesota, Derek Michael Chauvin caused the death of George Floyd by his culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk and taking a chance of causing death or great bodily harm to George Floyd. Easy for me to say, right? So if you boil that down, this is what the prosecutor has to prove. And again, number one, he's got to show that Chauvin caused the death of George Floyd. Number two, by culpable negligence. And what does that mean? Well, some people call that criminal negligence or recklessness. You were just doing something that was just above and beyond an accidental situation. You were acting recklessly. And in doing so, you created an unreasonable risk of death. And I think when you look at the facts, the knee to the back of the neck for 8+ minutes probably created an unreasonable risk of death. The last thing the prosecutor has to prove is that the defendant consciously took that risk. So in this case, he knew what he was doing. And I think that's probably clear over the course of 8 minutes that the officer knew what he was doing. So the issue is, did he cause the death, and was he reckless? This is probably, again, even easier for the prosecutor to prove. However, the penalty, if found guilty, is only up to 10 years in prison. So it's a lesser charge that carries with it a lesser sentence. So those are the 3 charges, and all 12 jurors must find the officer guilty to convict as to any one of those 3 charges. So they'll be given all 3 of those, in theory, that could be submitted by the prosecutor. That's the episode. I hope you liked it. Those are the charges against Officer Chauvin as to the death of George Floyd. If you did like it, smash that like button for me. If you got something to say, you got to comment. Put it in the comment section below. If you enjoy the channel, subscribe to it. And as always, I love it when you share me on social media. My name is Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you've been watching Lawyer Up.
Send lawyers, guns, and money.